familiar face.
Hi, Dr. Chomsky. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. Would you mind
Glad we finally connected.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Would you mind tilting your screen down a bit? I can just see your chin is cut off there. Cool.
How's that?
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm sure you get this all the time, but it's an honor to speak with you.
Thanks.
You know, I'll get started right away. I know your views on the state of the world today and of humanity are well documented. It seems we're on a fairly self-destructive path. I'd like to know what you think, how change is actually going to happen in the world.
There's only one way that change has ever happened, with very rare exceptions. Overwhelmingly in the past, change has taken place when people, what we call ordinary people, began to mobilize, began to become engaged, dedicated themselves to a struggle that's of everything you can think of. Can start with a few people. Take the anti-nuclear movement in England, CND, started with a small number. You ended up with a huge movement. The civil rights movement in the United States, scattered individuals. Many people really dedicated themselves with courage and intensity. A couple of black kids sitting in a lunch counter in North Carolina, the Freedom Riders going through the South. Pretty soon you had a huge mass movement. The women's movement, which has had a very significant effect on modern culture and society, began with small consciousness-raising groups going on with demands and pressures, and finally achieved something. And the great modern achievement of European society, which is now being dismantled by the Brussels bureaucrats and the banks, the modern welfare state, largely through labor activism over many years, which finally brought about changes. There's just no other way. Same here.
Would you say there's a conscious and concerted effort to prevent that from happening?
Well, of course, power systems never say, thank you, we're giving up our power. They'll do everything they can to retard it and prevent it. And that simply requires more engagement.
It seems like conflict is at the core of all the problems with humanity, both as individually and as a species, collectively. What do you think is at the core of that conflict of each individual?
First of all, there's also plenty of cooperation.
There is, for sure.
There are conflicts when there are different interests and concerns. You can try to adjudicate them sensibly, or you can approach them aggressively, and that'll lead to conflict. Take any case you like. Take, say, the problems in Ukraine right now. There are paths forward that you can imagine towards peaceful reconciliation, negotiations, there are plainly different interests and concerns. You can think of ways in which they could be accommodated. One possibility is to pursue them. The alternative possibility is to try to exacerbate them, say by sending delegations to call for a greater, for rejecting the concerns of the others and demanding solely your own rights, sending missile defense, so-called missile defense to Eastern Europe on our side, expanding the aggressive efforts to incorporate Ukraine into a Western system, not realizing that that's, of course, severe, they're not realizing or not caring, but severe security threat to the United States, to Russia. And on the other side, if, say, Putin were to give direct military support to secessionists in eastern Ukraine, which he apparently is not doing, that would exacerbate the tensions. There are always alternative paths you can follow.
Well, you know, I'd like to appeal to your philosophical side here. You know, I speak with a lot of, for this project, I'm speaking with spiritual leaders, a lot of the top scientists in the world, a lot of some politicians, and from people from every perspective. And they all seem to have their own answer to what is wrong and what the solution is. And it just seems to me that as long as there's a conflict, Would you say as long as there's an internal conflict in the human organism, that that will always reflect itself onto the world?
Uh, any person, you, me, my children, everyone else, is complex enough so that we have internal conflicts, and we try to resolve them. It's pretty much the same as before. Uh, you can tear yourself apart, or you can try to find a constructive way forward. I don't think there's any deep philosophical or spiritual issue here. It's something we're all quite familiar with.
Well, it's funny. The spiritual aspect, or suggests that the answers must come from within first. That you must examine yourself, and once you have a center, once you have a core value. I mean, you must have a core value that really reflects in everything you say and do.
I don't have a core value, and
Right.
I don't think anyone else does either. We have many values of greater and lesser significance, and sometimes we find they conflict with each other. So, for example, the freedom of speech is a very high value. I think it should be preserved, but it does run into conflicts. For example, do you provide freedom of speech to people who are trying to destroy the world, let's say?
Right.
That's a serious question, and they exist. So, for example, the major major sectors of corporate power in the United States are working overtime to try to ensure that their profits in the short term will be maximized by convincing people that either there is no global warming, or if there is, humans have nothing to do with it. Well, they're in fact announcing a kind of a death knell for the species. Should their freedom of speech be guaranteed? It's a conflict of values. I think it should, but can't argue that there's no conflict of values, and that happens all the time. People are not simple enough to have a single core value. We have many concerns, many values. Many of them we ought to assess, decide that they're really not valid. It's always good to look into the mirror to make sure, try to see if what you're doing is sensible and justified. Question your own reflexive judgments, your own commitments. That always makes sense, but you can't be paralyzed by it. You have to make decisions in life constantly on matters small and large.
Well, you seem very measured and very balanced, and you're obviously in the center of many world storms. With all the things that you've said, you must get a lot of flack. What do you do internally to remain centered and reasonable, or is it just your natural predilection?
There's plenty of inner turmoil. If you talk to people close to me, they'll know about it. But I think it makes sense to try to suppress it and at least make every attempt to address criticism, hysteria, shrieking, invective, whatever it may be, and there's plenty of it, to try to see if you can find in it points that are serious enough so that discussion and constructive engagement is possible. Often there are, sometimes there's not, in which you just have to dismiss it.
Was there a pivotal moment in your life that put you on this path that made you see the world the way that you see it today? Or was that an innate thing for you?
I don't know. I mean, it's innate for all of us. The question is what stimulates it and brings it forward. But so, for example, concern for the fate of others, sympathy, as it's been historically called, is probably just an innate property. Adam Smith, David Hume, other great figures took that for granted, and I think they're probably right. But it doesn't always manifest itself.
Right.
We all have our own experiences and our own choices and decisions. As far as I'm concerned, it's from early childhood. I grew up during the Depression, plenty of suffering. See it very close by. There was the rising threat of fascism, dark cloud over Europe, was pretty frightening, even to a child watching it. And these things shaped a perspective on a way of thinking about the world.
Do you get a sense of being an historical figure in the world? Do you get a sense of that you have a purpose, that you have a purpose and that you are fulfilling it to some degree?
Well, I have many purposes, and to some degree, I think they're being fulfilled. In other respects, not. So there are many causes that I've devoted an enormous effort to, and I felt that they were totally hopeless. Sometimes they were totally hopeless. Sometimes they actually succeeded. So it takes one of them, pick one. In 1975, Indonesia invaded the former Portuguese colony of East Timor. Violent act of aggression supported by the United States, by Britain, other great powers. Now, they carried out a literally genocidal, virtually genocidal assault on the population, maybe wiped out quarter of them or more. I was one of a small group of people who were devoting considerable effort to try to bring public attention to this, to try to bring about policy change, to try to save the remnants of in this incredibly poor, backward society. Mm-hmm. And to me, it seemed impossible, but we kept at it, and through a lot of efforts, not mine, but many others, finally it did succeed in pressuring the American government to call it off. In September 1979, happened. Never be sure. Its causes aren't necessarily lost.
So in your lifetime, you've seen a lot of change, a lot of dramatic societal change.
I'm sorry, the wrong date. 1999. Oh. After 25 years.
Yeah, but you've seen a lot of change over your lifetime, and you've been actively impassioned with it. What have you seen? How has humanity progressed over that time, from your point of view?
There's been quite a lot of progress. So take where I'm now sitting. I'm in my office at MIT University, where I've been since 1955. When I came, the political science department was openly funded by the CIA. It wasn't a secret. Through the 1960s, they were engaged, the department, as an academic department, was engaged in counterinsurgency work in South Vietnam. They had villas where they sent students to be advisors and so on. Of course, this was all under the rubric of a peace research institute. This is the age of Orwell, of course. There were closed seminars, secret seminars that I discovered when I was occasionally invited to speak in one. That would be impossible now. As a result of student activity, mainly in the late 60s. It was late, but it came. A small number of students, I could name them for you. They succeeded in changing the environment at the university to the extent that by 1969, there were the first serious efforts, institute-wide, whole university, to consider the question, which had really not been publicly raised before, about uses of technology and uses of science and their legitimacy. In fact, it got to the point that classes were suspended for a day to deal with this issue, and then it continued, and it's over time it changed the atmosphere of the university substantially, and it's changed in other ways. So when I came here in 1955, if you walked in the halls, you saw white males, well-dressed, quiet, deferential faculty with jackets and ties, and sweaty, I thought as well. That was the late 50s. You walk down the hall now, half women, maybe 40% minorities, casual dress, casual relations, informal interchange, interaction of all kinds. It's a total. Also, then you see booths and ads for all kind of activism and so on and so forth. Well, that's a big change. And it didn't just happen here, it happened across the country, in fact, across the world to a large extent. That's significant. And we can continue. Take what I was mostly engaged in the 1960s and continue to be opposition to aggression, violent aggression, the worst crime. In the early 60s, it was almost impossible to arouse any concern over the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam, later all of Indochina. Uh, just to give you an illustration, as late as October 1965, when the small anti-war movement tried to join an international day of protest, that was called, and have a demonstration in the Boston Commons, Boston Hyde Park, place for demonstrations. That was October 1965. South Vietnam had practically destroyed hundreds of thousands of American troops. The war extended to the north. We tried to have the demonstration, but it was broken up, physically broken up. I was supposed to be one of the speakers, couldn't hear a word. We were saved from real physical attack by plenty of state troopers. The liberal newspaper denounced the demonstration. How dare you criticize the holy state and so on. Boston's a liberal city, maybe the most liberal city in the country. March 1966 was the second International Day of Protest. We realized we couldn't have a public demonstration as you do on all sorts of issues. So we tried to arrange it in a church. Church was attacked. Tin cans, tomatoes. My wife, must have been 1965 or so, we had two little girls, she took them to a women's demonstration in Concord, Mass., the traditional seat of U.S. pacifism. There were women and children just standing, not saying much. They were attacked. That was the early 60s. A couple of years later, you had a huge anti-war movement, which we know had a big impact on ending the war. If you read the Pentagon Papers, they terminate in early 1968, right after the Tet Offensive in January 68. The government was thinking of sending lots more troops, but the military was opposed. They said they would need them for civil disorder control in the United States if more troops were sent. That affected the end result was horrendous, but it affected it. Come up to 2003, March 2003, the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq, the worst crime of the 21st century, another major crime of aggression. Pretty horrifying consequences, but it was the first time in the history of Western imperialism that there was massive protest even before the day the war was officially launched. And a lot of people feel it didn't have an effect. It went on anyway. They disagree with that. Bush, Blair, their associates never even dreamed of carrying out the measures that John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson used without a second thought in the early 1960s. Well, that's change in attitudes. It's not pure progress by any means, a lot of regression, but over time, I think we've become more civilized countries in many ways.
It's ironic that we're standing on the precipice of destruction of the species to some extent. I mean, it seems paradoxical that while on one hand people are more open and more willing to accept new liberal ideas, that there's a counterforce that seems to be just as powerful. How do you explain that polarity?
Easy. There are interests that do not want to give up their power and their profit. In the United States, the most important country, the major sectors of private enterprise, so-called private enterprise, state-supported private enterprise, the energy corporations, American Chamber of Commerce, which is the main business lobby, are quite openly, no secret, quite openly proclaiming that they are carrying out large-scale propaganda campaigns. They don't call it propaganda, PR campaigns to try to convince the public that either there's no global warming, just, climate always changes and so on, or else humans have nothing to do with it. Why? Because they're being threatened. Their profits are being threatened. I mean, these are corporations that spend, billions of dollars in new exploration, trying to exploit new sources of the fossil fuels that are about to destroy us. And in fact, if you look at the scientific evidence, there's pretty strong consensus that unless most of them, the overwhelming majority, stay in the ground, human life in any recognizable form is doomed. So sure, these conflicts are there, and they reflect the moral calculus of Anglo-American capitalism. Profits tomorrow far outweigh the fate of your grandchildren. That's and those who accept that moral calculus, yes, will use the power that they have, which is enormous, to try to drive us all over the precipice.
I know you haven't got much time, and there's one question I really want to get in. You're obviously a very eloquent and intelligent man, and if you had the ability to make a public service announcement to humanity, what would you say to humanity? What would you say to people?
Right now, what I would say is, of all the problems in the world, and there are plenty of them, there are two that cast a shadow over everything. Unless they're solved, nothing else is going to matter, no matter how serious it is. One is environmental catastrophe. The other is the threat of nuclear war, which is very real. It's a miracle that we've escaped since 1945. If you look at the record, it's just shocking. Unless these two problems, I kind of recall a statement of Bertrand Russell's, whose picture is right over there looking at me. Around 1960, I guess, he was asked why he was spending his time marching in the streets protesting nuclear weapons, but when he could have been developing his philosophical and scientific views and making a lasting contribution to civilization. And his answer was something like, if I don't march in the street, there isn't going to be anyone around to appreciate it. And that it's now a more severe situation. So the message to people of the world, I think, should be, take a look at the faces of your grandchildren, or imagine with them, do you want them to have a decent existence, or don't you care? That's a choice.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't know how much time I've got. Can I ask you a personal question? How are you dealing with old age?
Old age?
Old age.
85 is old.
Well, I'm sure that some things aren't working as well as they used to, and just the sense of mortality. Do you get your sense of mortality as you get older?
When I was about 10 years old, I used to have horrifying thoughts about how awful it would be to die, and mainly because if I die, it would mean that this spark of consciousness disappeared. And how do I even know that the rest of the world continues to exist?
Right.
That used to really trouble me around that age. And as I got a little older and came to terms with it, it doesn't bother me anymore.
So how did you resolve that?
Just by recognizing that it's dust to dust, and that's the way that's the way life works.
So you have no sense at all of not, I won't say an afterlife because that sounds too religious, but you have no sense of what happens to your energy after your physical body dies? Do you have any idea about that?
The spirit, if you're buried, the body decomposes, it contributes to more life.
And what about spirit? Do you believe in that there is a spirit, that there is a Noam Chomsky spirit, that upon the physical death that spirit is intact in some form?
Well, there's for every person, there's some kind of legacy that you leave behind, the impact of what you've done. For example, to go back a couple of minutes, did you care for your grandchildren enough to do something to retard disaster? That'll live on, positive or negative.
So what would you like your legacy to be?
I'd like it to be, there's several domains. There's actually my main intellectual interests are professional work, which I think is pretty exciting. I think could be carried forward in ways which will give us quite a lot of insight into the kind of creatures human beings are. I'd like to see that pursued. Maybe I'm on the right path, maybe the wrong path, but whatever it is, I'd like to see that be carried forward significantly. But in the human domain, the domain of human life, it's basically what we've been talking about. To whatever extent there's a positive impact in securing decent human life, saving people's lives, ensuring that they have sustenance, the rights that every person should have, to the tiny extent that I can contribute to that. I'd like that to be a legacy, of course.
You know, somebody, when I mentioned I was speaking with you today, someone asked me, I asked him, was there a question that you particularly wanted me to ask? And he mentioned that, is there a question that hasn't been asked of you that you would like to answer, that should have been asked of you? I mean, you seem to have an opinion on everything, and you have a view, and you've considered a lot of things. Is there something that hasn't been asked as much as it should be?
Yeah. One question that isn't asked as much as it should be is why, throughout my life, have I delayed so long in becoming engaged in things of immense significance? And I can give you case after case.
Please do. So
Of
why
course.
is that? Why?
Well, they take the Vietnam War, which consumed me and my energies in the 1960s. In fact, I was just about to go for a long prison sentence, probably ended by the Tet Offensive. But at the time to become involved, I became involved seriously in the early 60s. Time to become involved was 10 years earlier. Take, say, environmental issues. The time to become involved at the very latest was the early 70s.
Right.
I didn't do very much until the last 10 or 15 years. And you can mention case after case.
Is that because you're really self-absorbed in your career, or was it you're just unaware of these issues, or?
It's a mixture of personal deficiencies, lack of knowledge, interest in doing something else, the kind of things we're all familiar with. What keeps us from doing the things at some level we know we ought to do?
And you feel like now you're doing everything you should be doing, or you feel that you're?
No, I think the questions can be asked now, too.
Yeah.
I gotta go off.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Truly, it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Good to talk to you.
Thank
Glad
you.
it finally worked.
Yes, thank you.